Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at Call of Duty Black Ops 7 using the RTX 5090. We're using the MSI Gaming X Trio version of the card with 32 gigabytes of GDDR7 video memory. We're playing on the latest NVIDIA drivers and pairing with 64 gigabytes of DDR5 as well as a 9800 X3D. Let's hop in. Alright, simple enough, starting off here at 4K. Typically I go 1080p to 4K, but for the 5090 here, I'm going to start off at 4K, max settings. So that's our extreme preset here. And we're just going to be playing at native. So loading in here at 4K, extreme settings, max settings, and native resolution. Pretty impressive. We're seeing essentially perfect performance. 1% lows are, phenomenal. We are using quite a bit of video memory. This game's video memory usage, I have called it out in some other videos, but it's a little strange. Like, it's almost like it kind of responds depending on what GPU we're using. So, if we were using like a 16 gigabyte GPU, maybe it would be using 14 gigabytes of video memory here. And that may seem like, okay, maybe that's the bottleneck, or one of the bottlenecks is video memory, but actually it doesn't seem to be the case. So anyways, also besides the fact, the video memory is a little strange. So if you're seeing like, oh, it's using, 18 gigabytes or 19 gigabytes of video memory here, so it would be bottlenecked on something like a 5080. Not necessarily the case. The video memory usage in this game is just a little bit weird. It seems to manage it and call it and recall it like in an efficient way that it kind of just works. Haven't had any sort of video memory issues across a lot of different tests by now. But obviously this is a really nice setting. We are playing at native resolution. There is just that default TAA being applied over it. TAA is kind of not a great anti-aliasing method, but when you are working with a 4K resolution, it becomes slightly less important. So obviously really solid performance here, some variation, but just sitting right under 200 FPS. And what's more important than that 200 FPS is the really great 1% lows that we see here. This is kind of just the nice thing about having a 5090 or a card like a 5090, a 5080, whatever it is that you can just come in here, crank settings oftentimes, play at 4K, and have a good experience. You don't really have to tweak with very many things. But of course, me being me and this being a benchmark, we are going to see where we can get to with a little bit of tweaking. So really the first thing to do here is just to use a little bit of DLSS. Now, one thing I do like about this game is it gives you the model to choose from within the settings. So let's just throw on just a little bit. So just quality DLSS. This will actually likely result in a better looking picture because now we're using that transform model DLSS, which is a great transformer model. It's a great DLSS model. So it actually resolves in really solid looking anti-aliasing. And as you can see, that anti-aliasing, although it's using upscaling, it may seem kind of strange, but it's actually getting more poor performance, not as good performance as just stock native with no DLSS. So it's a little bit unusual. I have noticed that across other testing as well. Is just the TAA model itself is very, very lightweight. So if you're okay with that version of anti-aliasing, you will be rewarded with just a little bit of an improvement when it comes to your performance. But you are obviously getting, in my opinion, even at quality here, you are getting a much, much stronger picture. You could also go for DLAA. The only thing and the reason I'm not testing DLAA is DLAA uses a CNN model and there's no way to change that. And unfortunately, maybe with NVIDIA Profile Inspector, you might be able to change it. But as far as just the easy option of changing it within the NVIDIA app, Call of Duty Black Ops 7, the beta here at least, actually is not appearing in the NVIDIA app yet. Black Ops 6 is, and I'm sure Black Ops 7 will at full release, but at least at this point, while I'm sure you can come in and change it, it's just not super, super easy. And of course, we could come in, and especially being at 4K, we can certainly come in and just kind of crank the settings. So going for ultra performance here will net us a pretty significant increase to our FPS. And given the fact that we are at 4K resolution and on the transform model, it actually doesn't look too bad. In fact, in a way, it almost looks sharper than just like the native option. So I would recommend, if you are playing at 4K using a card like a 5090, just see what it looks like throwing it on like an ultra performance model. You are going to be rewarded at this point now, certainly with a major improvement to your FPS. But really I don't know if I want to say surprising part, but the part that you may not expect is that I actually think that this looks really close to native. And in some ways, almost even a little bit better than native, in that it's kind of like a sharper image, like in certain areas. Obviously there's that sharpness slider. It's kind of like an artificial sharpness, not necessarily sharp because the pixels are being rendered so perfectly, more so just kind of a sharpness filter being applied over the picture. But in my opinion, the results are really great. So 4K in general here is going to be, you know, max settings here. You're going to have a lot of great options to choose from, and it is pretty impressive. I mean, I know we're on a $2,000 GPU, so, you know, honestly nothing should really impress us, but getting like close to 300 FPS at 4K max settings here with no frame generation, which I'm taking a stand against. I'm not going to test frame generation on a 5090. I think, you know, buying a 5090 and then artificially inserting frames is just terrible. I would never do that personally, but you know, you could obviously at this point, but getting an artificial 600 frames at this point where you're already kind of natively getting at least 300, close to 300 real frames just with upscaling, I think that's a much more reasonable option. So before we move down to, you know, competitive minimum settings, I just want to see what going down 1 to ultra does. What I've found is that balance kind of basically looks like minimum anyways. Basic, balance, and minimum all kind of look pretty terrible, but ultra still looks decent, and we are able to get what I'm expecting to be a bit higher FPS. So coming down just a little bit from extreme, one notch down to ultra here, does give us a pretty significant FPS improvement while not actually hurting our visual quality too much. So I do think that this is somewhat of a compelling option. The main things that you'll notice that kind of look bad when we do start in a minute to change some of our settings are the textures and the shadows. Here you can see everything looks totally fine. Now, especially being a competitive game, a really fast-paced game, you may not notice when, you know, some of these visuals do start to suffer a little bit, but in my opinion, you know, if you are just slightly unhappy with the performance that you were getting at Extreme, which I couldn't really see that being the case because our performance was so solid at Extreme, you could bump down just a little bit and reclaim some of that FPS. And now let's go ahead and just throw on that DLSS at Ultra Performance, which really looks pretty solid here at 4K. And now we're getting very similar performance here, likely a bit better, hovering pretty close to 300 FPS. So yeah, in my opinion, you know, there's not really a ton more performance to be gained. I mean, a 4K monitor, like my 4K monitor is 240 hertz. As far as I know, that's on the higher end of refresh rates for 4K monitors. I don't think very many people are playing at 360 plus hertz on 4K panels yet, but obviously there are other benefits. Even if your display can't display the pixels or the frames effectively, there is, you know, lowered input latency, and just to see kind of what the performance looks like, it is definitely impressive that we're averaging 271, really solid 1% lows, flat frame time graph. So yeah, in general here, 4K, either ultra or extreme settings, a lot of options for you to choose from. Ultra performance DLSS here does look really great on the transformer model, so certainly have a lot of options to choose from, and they all look really solid. So the other thing that I do want to test on each setting here is just going for the minimum preset here. So this is really just if you just want, you know, a very competitive setting, you don't care about visuals, you just want to play at your resolution, being 4K here, and you just want the highest possible frame. So we'll start off here minimum at native 4K. So as you can see, obviously turning down to minimum settings is a way to reclaim a lot of that FPS. Now we're getting very, very high FPS here at native 4K resolution. And, you know, in motion, if you're not looking closely, this does look like serviceable, in my opinion. But as soon as you kind of stop, slow down, say if you know I got hurt, kind of tuck back here, you can see just how bad some of these textures look. Textures take a major hit, especially at 4K, you know, when we are looking at certainly playing on a bigger screen, seeing these things a little more clearly. Those textures do look pretty bad. When we go ADS, you can see the gun. The textures on our gun are pretty terrible. And the other thing that's really noticeable is the shadow quality. So obviously, like incredibly pixelated shadow quality. Now, if you're playing at minimum settings, you likely know all of that, and especially if you're playing at minimum settings on a 5090, you know that's worth the trade-off to you. You just want highest possible FPS, and certainly you are going to be rewarded with very high FPS. Remember, we're at native right now, so hoping that there will be a bit more performance on the table for us to kind of reclaim as we start introducing a bit of DLSS. But even at native here, this is, you know, definitely a compelling option if you are just kind of looking for getting the most out of your GPU from a FPS standpoint purely. So here at minimum, once again, last thing to do is just to throw on DLSS at ultra performance. So this is really just, you know, maximum possible performance here at 4K. And we are certainly getting a pretty impressive performance increase now, well above 300 FPS on our average, 1% lows at 230. only using like 6 gigabytes of video memory, so obviously incredibly lightweight kind of settings to go with here. But if you were, you know, just someone who has a 4K monitor, you want the highest possible performance on your 5090, you don't care about visuals, you just want to occupy your 4K monitor, this is certainly an option, when I do understand that people do like to go for it from time to time. And honestly, just running around playing the game, as long as you're not kind of stopping and trying to admire visuals or anything like that, you are going to be having a pretty decent experience. And some things still look good, like reflections look decent. It's really just the textures and the shadows, in my opinion, are the two major things that are really taking a pretty massive hit. Even the lighting in general still looks like relatively the same. So I can certainly understand someone who, you know, just wants maximum possible 4K performance coming in here, getting 300 plus FPS with, you know, really solid 1% lows. Now bumping down to 1440p, going for our max setting. I don't know what causes this to kind of change to not 100% resolution scale, but we are on max settings here, native resolution. So here at 1440p extreme settings, obviously incredibly high FPS, very competitive settings here. So you know, the main thing that I'm impressed with, more so than just the high FPS on the 5090 here, which is to be expected, is just Call of Duty is just always been this way. Really, I can't remember the last time there was a Call of Duty release that was poorly optimized. The 1% lows, how smooth the frames are being delivered. I know, you know, people probably take it for granted to a certain extent. If it's Call of Duty, it's a competitive game, but I am so happy that, you know, Call of Duty releases are so stable when it comes to 1% lows. You can really reliably come in here with a lot of different hardware. Don't need a 5090 by any means and get really consistent, stable frames. So let's go ahead now and just throw on our DLSS. Now here at 1440p, I wouldn't go as low as ultra performance, so let's just leave it at balanced here. I think this will be a good middle point of kind of, you know, regaining a little bit of FPS, using that transformer model, getting a little bit more advanced of an anti-aliasing solution. And this does give us a slightly noticeable 20 or so FPS increase, and really the transformer model, I don't know. I mean, I probably talk about it too much when I'm benchmarking these NVIDIA cards on games that support the transform model, but I just don't think I can overstate how solid it looks. I mean, it's really just such a great thing to have available, and you know, you're able to get oftentimes a increase in your FPS and an improvement in your visual quality. So typically we're upscaling, may receive, you know, you might get a slightly worse picture on a transform model like this. You're actually oftentimes getting a better picture and also getting a little bit more FPS, or a lot more FPS, depending on you know, the options that you select. So obviously really solid option here. I probably would just apply a DLSS model anyways, even just for the anti-aliasing, even if you're happy with your performance, unless you're happy already with the visuals that you're getting. But I would just recommend just checking out what just throwing on DLSS at either, you know, balanced or quality does for you. I do think the transform model just looks so incredible. All right, next up, let's go for that minimum preset here. So just looking for maximum possible FPS here at 1440p native. So coming here at minimum 1440p settings seems to be kind of where we are touching a bit of that CPU bound scenario, now that we're seeing our GPU utilization kind of fluctuate in the 90s, not necessarily lock so high. So it looks like around 300 or so FPS at 1440p might be kind of the max of what this particular pairing can generate on a good day. So we will certainly try a bit of that DLSS, though I'm not really expecting it to drastically improve our FPS at this point, due to the fact that our GPU utilization is actually seeming to be a bit you know, not super stable here. So it seems to indicate that maybe our CPU is actually what is in fact holding us back. So just out of curiosity, let's see, and I don't know why this always resets, super annoying, our render resolution, but let's see what we can get here using this DLSS. So we're going to throw on DLSS at ultra performance, so minimum settings, ultra performance DLSS, and honestly the picture quality looks pretty decent. Our GPU utilization is still a bit fluctuating. I was not expecting to really get much, if anything, as far as an improvement to our FPS, so it is nice. Now we're touching 400 FPS at times. 1% lows at right around 250. Looks like we're averaging out in the high 300s, so clearly a very nice experience here. Very high refresh rate, feels very smooth, fluid. 1% lows are great. So 1440p if you are just looking for a competitive like setting. not hard to achieve here at all whatsoever on a 5090. Not super surprising, but still, you know, nice to see nonetheless. All right, last up here, not that, you know, I really think many people are playing at 1080p on a 5090, but it's fun to see always these sort of things. So 1080p max settings at native resolution. So here at 1080p max settings, we are actually surprisingly still not CPU bound. Now, I don't know if this is necessarily a bad thing, or in fact, I know it's not a bad thing, so... but it is a bit surprising. I'd imagine that 5090-9800X 3D would be CPU bound at 1080p, but we are still at max settings, which are a bit demanding, it seems to be in Black Ops 7 here, but as you can see, 300 FPS, really impressive 1% lows, all the way up at like above 200, so really great experience here. If you were playing at 1080p on a 5090, you're probably used to having really stellar experience, and this one is really no different. You're not really going to have any issue whatsoever playing this game at great resolution, or great, not resolution necessarily, but at really great settings and a really competitive high FPS, even natively here. And again, not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I do just want to see at this, you know, extreme setting, if we did throw on, let's just go for balanced DLSS here, due to the fact that really DLSS at 1080p, even though it is really impressive, I still wouldn't really go much lower. And we're actually kind of seeing similar things we're seeing in other settings. And in fact, the game looks much better, much sharper here. I'm not sure if it really comes through on a YouTube video, but it does look considerably sharper here at 1080p using DLSS. So it's just definitely the benefit. You know, TAA, while it is certainly acceptable at 1440p and 4K, at 1080p, that is kind of where it becomes a little more necessary to use a more mature anti-aliasing solution, such as DLSS or DLAA, if you would want to go for that route. I'm just not testing DLAA in this particular test because I just don't like that DLAA is using the CNN model, and I think that the transform model of DLSS that we have here is going to look better than DLAA anyways, and I've seen that from my previous tests. And until we can easily implement the transform model into the DLAA preset, I don't really think it's worth using DLAA because the image quality is just not really going to be anywhere close to even just using some mild upscaling. And again, this is really just for fun, going for that minimum preset here at native resolution at 1080p. So here at the minimum preset here at 1080p, we are kind of in that similar spot where we were seeing around 300 FPS at 1440p. Now we're seeing GPU utilization kind of all over the place in the 70s at times, 80s even. Kind of stuck right around 300 FPS. Doesn't look like we're going to be really varying too far off of that. The other issue that, you know, people don't really talk about too much is when you are in a CPU bound scenario, your frames are just a little less consistent. So we are getting pretty consistent 1% lows at 190, but coming from 300 FPS average, that's not as good of a experience as we were kind of getting when we were GPU bound. So you definitely don't want to be in a CPU bound scenario. Typically that does result in just a little less consistent frames. So bumping up settings or ideally resolution would be something that you would want to do. And again, just for fun, just to see what we can get here, if we just throw on DLSS and max it out. Again, ultra performance at 1080p is not something I would do, but just because we've come this far, I just want to see if we can push this up to close to 400 frames or anything like that, or if we are just going to be kind of limited by our CPU. And it does look like 300 FPS, even at 1080p with ultra performance DLSS, is really kind of around the max where our CPU really wants to be. We are seeing, I did see as high as 350 there, 340 now, back to 320. You can see just like, it's just not a super consistent experience, so not necessarily something that you'd want to see. And really, you know, the difference between getting 300 frames here and 300 frames at, you know, our extreme setting with a little bit of DLSS, I would highly recommend opting for a higher, you know, graphics preset in order to get a little bit more consistent frames. Anyways, guys, that's been it. The Call of Duty Black Ops 7 beta on the RTX 5090. Not super surprising. I typically try to leave the 5090 for last when I'm doing these benchmarks, just because I think that most people with a 5090, they kind of just try everything and assume that their card can run. So really these benchmarks are much more just to see, you know, oh, I'm just curious and maybe I don't want to play the game, or I just kind of want to see what the actual benchmark would look like. What kind of FPS can it provide? And obviously, surprise to absolutely no one, Call of Duty Black Ops 7 here is well optimized for, you know, a lot of GPUs that are way less powerful than a 5090. And really the only surprising part, if there is one, is just that unfortunately DLAA only uses that CNN model so far. So when we are, you know, looking at just the actual picture quality, we are going to be getting better results going for a DLSS model, even if we don't necessarily need the frames. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next one. Bye-bye.